All right. Hey, this is Julie Johnson. I'm one of the founders of Integrate Trauma Informed Network. I'm in St. Louis recording this, and we have Annie Shiel with us, who is a trauma informed yoga teacher and co-founder of TrueU, which she'll talk more about, which is an organization that empowers teen girls, right? With yoga?
Actually, everyone now.
Everyone, okay, teens.
Yeah.
All teens, right. All teens with yoga. I'm going to hand it over to her. We're going to be getting to know her a little bit with some questions, and we'll go from there. Okay? Go for it.
Cool.
Okay.
So my name is Annie Shiel. I'm a trauma yoga teacher. I'm here right now at Stanford, California. I'm doing my master's degree, actually in international policy, so kind of two lives there. I moved to Washington, D.C., which is where I did a lot of my work and where TrueU, which I'll talk about in a bit, is based. Let's see. I started yoga as a teenager, which is extraordinarily valuable, and as you'll see, has informed a lot of my work with teens. And as happens to a lot of people, I had stopped playing soccer year-round and started looking to yoga for another way of exercising. And like I was going to say, like happens to a lot of people, I kind of swung too far in the other direction. It was like, wow, my body feels really good when I do yoga. Like I can see muscles I've never seen before. And started like really overdoing it and started dealing with a lot of kind of body image issues that are unfortunately pretty common in the yoga community. And so that was kind of my first, kind of the way that I got into the trauma-informed stuff, because yoga was so powerful for me. Learning how to listen to my body. And even though I like rolled my eyes every time a teacher said it in class, like it turns out if they say it enough, it just gets in there. And so without even really knowing anything about trauma-informed yoga, that's been a more recent journey for me. When I did my teacher training during my freshman year of college, actually, I was really focused on body image issues. All right.
Keep going.
Okay, cool. I was really focused on body image issues, so I did some work with the McGill Eating Disorder Clinic. I did a class for them that was really, really wonderful, and kind of mixed students from the community and also folks that were at the clinic, and you didn't know who was who. And that was a really awesome experience for me in terms of learning how to work with specific populations and teach use the language of body positivity more, that had so resonated with me. And so when I moved, so that was in Montreal where I went to college, and so I moved down to DC, I was looking to start to do some of this work with teens, right? Because I was teaching at studios that I loved, and I was teaching adults, and I kind of kept coming back to this idea that I really wanted to work with teenagers because that had been so valuable to me. At this point, I was really focused on teenage girls and body image and the impact of yoga. And so that's when I can talk more about this later with TrueU, but essentially, once we started working with teens, in DC, a lot of the teens were the folks where there was demand for this work. We were working with a lot of teens from low-income school districts, really historically oppressed and vulnerable communities, and we started doing that teaching, and I was like, I'm not equipped for this, because there was body image plus like 1,000 other things, histories of trauma, stuff like that. And I really started to seek out the trauma-informed specific training. And of course, that's also made me a much better studio teacher, because you don't know who walks into your class. You don't know the trauma history or lack thereof of each student. And so it's definitely made me a better teacher in a general adult studio as well.
Right. I like what you said earlier, because I see this a lot, well, with myself and also just with just the population in general, about what you said earlier in your history about being a sport, being an athlete, and how to like be in your body in yoga, that is like, I mean, a really difficult skill to like switch from, from that mentality of I'm going to go for performance-based goals, to like, I do exactly what my body says it needs to do, and that's it. That is a big paradigm switch from what, in myself, and also just people who go, not it's even just yoga, just people that switch into sort of that mind-body perspective.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's not just, and for me it was coming from athletics, but I was also coming from, and like still struggle a lot with, kind of perfectionism and this like very mentality. And I'm sure it's really hard to transition from that space to like, okay, here in this room where I'm doing yoga, like on this yoga mat, it's okay for me to, it's actually like encouraged. Like sometimes my teacher gives me a reward when I take child's pose and I rest and I give myself what I need. And that's kind of the kind of teaching that I aspire to make sure that students really understand that this is a space where it's safe to do that.
Cool. That's fantastic. Well, that sounds like quite a journey. But I know several other yoga teachers who have, that switch. It's such a paradigm shift to think about. You're right. It's a form of disassociation. To like force yourself to do things. I mean, like I think about now, like all the years I was in track and field, and like I got super sick actually doing like long distance running. I'm like, oh, that's because my body doesn't like to do long distance running. Like it was telling me. And I was, so it is quite, no matter whether it's yoga or whatever you decide to do, it's like listening to your body, how far where your limits are, is like, and finding your edge, wherever that edge is, and honoring it is like
a huge part of the philosophy behind trauma-informed teaching in yoga, especially, is this idea of like learning to trust your body's instincts again too, because if you spend so long in that mindset, like, I mean, I think back to the kinds of workouts that I would do on the amount of food that I had when I was suffering, when I was like in these patterns of disordered eating. And it is shocking to me that my body withstood that.
Right.
Because the mind is really powerful. When the mind says, no, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, that happens. And of course, when you look at folks with history of trauma, there's also an enormous amount of distrust in the body that comes out of that experience, because in some way or another, your body has perhaps failed you, or you think that it has. And so for sure, like learning to trust your body again and learning to even make those small connections, like, oh, like I feel pain here, I'm going to stop doing it, is really big.
It's a huge step. It's a huge step in healing for sure, and in social, emotional, and physical healing for sure. Yeah. So that's awesome. Well, that's pretty powerful. Okay, so you also, among your trauma-informed teaching, you also co-founded an organization that you mentioned earlier called TrueU, which is an organization that empowers teens with yoga, with mindfulness, and other self-discovery tools to promote self-worth, resiliency, and community leadership. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and the vision behind it? I mean, we follow you on Instagram. It sounds like you guys are just doing some really cool stuff all over the country. So,
yeah. So I'll start actually with the vision behind it. As I mentioned, I was like in DC. I wanted to work with teen girls specifically, focus more on the body image stuff to start, but I didn't have any teens. Like I was like a 20-something. Like I didn't know any teenagers in DC. I didn't have a lot of friends with kids. So I was kind of reaching out to different studio owners at the studios I was teaching to figure out like how to do this work that I desperately wanted to do and thought was really important. And I reached out to my co-founder, Meredith Van Sant, who is the owner of 405 Yoga in DC and also Oklahoma City. And I was just like, hi, like I want to do this work. Do you have any ideas? Do you know any organizations that are doing this where I can teach, etc.? And she was like, this is amazing that you reached out. Like her background was in human development, focused on teen resiliency. And so she was like, yeah, let's do this. Like, let's do this work ourselves. And she's also a yoga teacher, and she's also like an entrepreneurial powerhouse. And so she just kind of got us up and running, made the beautiful website that you see. And we just kind of started cold calling organizations. And it turns out that this work was really, really in demand. And we started teaching you can see all our partners on our website, but we started in DC teaching at a few charter schools, teaching at after school programs. And the model that we follow, it kind of has 3 parts. So we do trauma-informed, accessible, body-positive yoga. And again, that's going to look different than it's going to be like when you walk into an adult studio, because we're working with kids, teens.
So keep going. I have a sub question to this. Keep going.
Number 2 is mindfulness. So meditation, breath work. Again, we focus on making that pretty accessible too. And then what we call True Talk, which is essentially from their yoga mats. If they have, we usually don't actually have yoga mats, but from their space in the room, they sit down and do kind of a journaling exercise. So we give a different prompt focused on some sort of kind of self-compassion, confidence-based theme, self-worth. And they do a brief journaling exercise. Some of them draw depending on age and ability. And then we have an opportunity to share out to the group, which is optional, but usually ends up going quite well. And that's kind of based on this idea that when you start off, that feeling that you get when you do yoga, if you do yoga, and you're kind of suddenly in your body and you're connected, and being able to write from that place is can be really healing and powerful. So that's kind of the model that we use.
Oh, I like how you guys have your own model. I actually coordinate a yoga program called Fit Abilities Yoga, which is why I'm going to ask you this. It's like an adapted yoga program. Because I'm a special ed teacher, and we embed yoga into our program, into our teaching, like in the school system. I teach in Ferguson, Florissant, and so obviously that's a needed area, similar to probably what you have in DC, and so as I was wondering, because the term like accessible yoga has like become a very I don't know. It's just become a really broad, like term, and like as like from like a special education, like adaptive perspective, we think one people hear accessible, but then other like people of color think like include. You know what I mean? So I was wondering, based off of what you guys do with TrueU, how do you guys approach accessible, like the concept of what accessible yoga means to you?
So that's a really good point, and I should actually be a lot more careful about the way that I use the word accessible, because I'm thinking more about taking a yoga practice and bringing it to a community that is not used to this practice and making it something that they take to.
Right.
So teenagers. We have typically had able-bodied students in all of our classes. Okay. There have definitely been students with special needs, but they're not readily identified to us. So there are times when we say like, you can draw if you need to draw for the journaling piece. But yes, I'm taking a much more broad look at accessibility, and that is something that we would love to get better at, is kind of like the different facets of accessibility.
Right. But it's a broad picture, and it's in front of everyone. There's no right or wrong way. It was just, I was wondering based off of your, like, from our like perspective for Fit Abilities, like we're looking at like physical access or like just universal design, you know, for how do we make it accessible for kids with for our kids it's visual impairments, you know, but how do we make that accessible? So I always like to explore and ask other people that bring yoga into these different communities how they break down that term.
I will say that in terms of accessibility, one thing that we do try to focus on and change, we do try to make sure that in terms of physical ability that we're catering to all body sizes. So everyone is very able in the classes that we teach with the teens, but for sure there are folks that are, you know, stepping forward can be hard if you don't have as much space. So we definitely try to like step back when we can. We make changes like that. Another unique experience that I've had too that definitely required me to like go online and do some searching. 405 Yoga is right next to Gallaudet University.
Oh, okay.
In Washington D.C., which is a deaf university.
Yeah.
And we've had the privilege before, and I think they're going to have another one soon, of having deaf teachers or folks who can teach in ASL. Come in and teach, and that's been really, really interesting to see and learn about. And we'll often have deaf students in our class, and it definitely takes some there's a learning curve for a teacher like me who had not thought about that before in my teaching. Figured, okay, I need to cue from the back of the room. I need to figure out how to work the lights in Shavasana to make sure that folks are comfortable and know what's going on. So yeah, big fan of going home and doing research when you realize you're out of your league and asking people. And
right. That's very, and speaking of asking people, you know, because you're out in Oakland now, you know that my partner Victoria is out in Oakland, right?
I actually did not know that.
Yeah, she's actually in Oakland doing practice. So you guys,
that's so cool.
You guys should connect, because she's doing some networking up. We're actually going out there this next fall, so we'll have to meet up with you. But she's in Oakland. So she's in Oakland. I forgot what the exact area is, but anyway, so she's over on the Oakland side. Are you over there, or are you in
I'm in
San
Palo
Francisco? Oh, you're in Palo Alto. Okay. Oh yeah, that's right, because you're at Stanford. That makes sense. So not too far away. But a little bit. So yeah, so I meant to tell you that. So if you had that, she's out there now. So FYI. Okay, so
I forgot to mention about accessibility and the kind of the last piece in the story of TrueU.
mhm.
I mentioned we originally were working with girls.
Oh, okay, right. That's what I thought. I remember hearing that. Okay.
Yeah, so we were originally focused on girls, and we found as we were working with a bunch of organizations in DC that even though we were working with organizations that were designed for girls, we still are coming up and meeting students whose gender identity is more fluid, who are non-binary, just a lot of gender diversity that we hadn't necessarily expected, that makes it so that when we come in and we say, hey girls, or we're focused on girls, it just didn't feel very inclusive and didn't feel like what we were really trying to do. And then of course we also know that the work that we do on yoga and mindfulness and kind of self-discovery is also of course extraordinarily valuable for teenage boys.
Absolutely.
And, right. And so about maybe 6 months to a year into our work, we decided we're just going to cut the part of the name that says girls, and we're going to be TrueU, and we're going to focus on all gender identities. And that's worked really, really well for us, and we love it. So.
And that's awesome, especially with all of the issues of toxic masculinity going on. That is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And and I'll get into this later, but with all of as much as teens are starting, there's more trans kids that are identified as trans they're younger and younger, so that's going to become more of an issue, I think, as we evolve as a species. So, I think
we felt very good about making that switch.
Okay, so so as a trauma-informed yoga teacher, establishing a sense of trust with your yoga students is obviously really important. How do you personally attempt to create a sense of trustworthiness as much as you can with your yoga students? How do you create that container?
Yeah, so one thing that is really central to trauma-informed yoga is a sense of agency. So even though I'm guiding students through sequences, poses, I make sure in all of my classes that students understand that they have like total freedom to do whatever they need to do, move however they want to move. And the second piece of that, which is really important to trust as well, is committing to that, like making sure that I follow through. So right. At the beginning of my class, like I will not be offended if you do something completely different. And it's up to me to not be offended and to make sure that students, once they make that choice, feel really safe and empowered to keep doing what they're doing. I also think it's really important for yoga teachers to make personal introductions with students when they walk in. I'm not a big fan of raise your hand if you have an injury or if you don't want to be touched today. I, as much as I possibly can, check in with each new student that I don't know, ask them if they have any injuries, make sure that they're comfortable, or ask if they're comfortable with assists. That kind of one-on-one interaction makes it much more likely that a student who is uncomfortable with assists will tell you that. And then also committing to all the other cueing that I give in a class. So letting students know how long they'll be in a pose and committing to that. Not giving assists when I don't have permission. And then the sequencing as well, and this is not so much an issue of trust with me, but yoga is, as we mentioned, really, really valuable in getting students to trust their own bodies and instincts again. And so the sequences that include kind of more repetition, where students can start to feel like they know where they're going next over time, are also really helpful for that.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's huge, and I really like how you said you tell them what the poses are ahead of time, right? Yeah. Is that what you said? Yeah, I think that's
how long they'll be in the pose ahead of time, and I tell them usually where we're going in the transition so that they can take as long as they need to get there.
I think that's great. I haven't heard that tactic as much, and I think that's a really great practice to have for sure. And I'm just coming from my own experience, so I think that's great. I sometimes, even like in yin, like those sorts of yoga classes where you're in it for like 5 minutes, I was like, man, that would be so great, like to just like have those, even if you're in it for like, we're gonna do this flow for like a couple, like 3 times, like whenever you're done. Just those prompts are so helpful, just to be able to obviously I think anticipate the next thing, because nothing's worse than, and not, nothing having something change on you really quickly when you're in the midst of that. So
yeah, and I think too that knowing where you're going, even if it's a rough outline, right? Like the structure of my classes, even like week to week, if you take my class multiple times, the structure will always be the same. Like, of course, I'll change it up, and so there'll be new transitions. But just knowing the structure and knowing where you're going also gives you this kind of container to say, okay, I know that when we get here, I'm maybe going to take a rest, or I know that this is coming and I can opt out of this. Just knowing what you're in for can be really, really helpful from a trauma-informed perspective.
That's fantastic. That is, yeah, that's really powerful. Absolutely, and a very good tool to have in your tool belt when you're teaching. Okay, so in traditional yoga, so I think we might be overlapping here a little bit, but this is central though to like the yoga philosophy, which actually I had like a sub question based on what you just said, but I'll probably put it in here as I talk. It often feels like there's a hierarchical structure between the yoga teacher and the students. So what practices do you use to break this sense of hierarchy and reinforce to the students that they are their own teachers? And I guess what I'm trying to say is like, that is very, like, this is where trauma-informed yoga varies differently than like what is taught like in a typical YTT yoga teacher training,
Yeah.
And so I get a lot of answers on this and a lot of different perspectives. So I'm sure you and I are going to the same page, but I just wonder how you're able to get through that, because I know that's a trigger for a lot of people that have been through yoga teacher training, is that nature. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, so first of all, I have taught a couple of teacher trainings at 405 back in DC, and we include a trauma-informed module in all of them, and I think that that's super important. And we also focus on teaching teachers to give agency to their students in that training as well. And so I think it's a lot of the same stuff as establishing trust. Like, I think it's super important that students understand that they have the agency, they are in charge of their body, right? My job as a teacher is to guide them and hold space for them for whatever it is that they're coming in with, and their job is to listen to their body, to kind of decide where their practice is going to go, and use that space the way that they need it. So one of the cues I actually often say is to listen to your body over my voice, right? If your breath is faster or slower than my count, you focus on yours. And then also little things like, letting students know that, okay, I'm the teacher and I decided that this sequence maybe would feel good in someone's body, but I don't know how your body feels. Right. So I'll often say things, and students often laugh, but I think it's really important. I'll say, if this feels terrible in your body, then don't do it. Like, we'll have like an interlace with our hands, and I'll say, if you hate this, let it go.
Right.
And I'll see students let it go.
Right.
If I hadn't said that, they would have been like, "Ugh, this feels terrible, and I have to stay here in this pose because the teacher said so."
Because sometimes you have to, because I remember being in that state, because I did yoga as well as when I was in high school. I started, and I remember, those early years, like I was like, this is what I have to do to there's like this mind frame, especially like when you're sort of in a sort of a traumatized mindset doing yoga, you're kind of like in this state of like, I have to do this, like the perfectionism, I have to do it this way. So I'm glad that you give them permission, because sometimes you actually have to hear, you're like, oh, I do have permission to do that. Great. Just sometimes I need the person in charge to tell me that, unfortunately.
Yeah. When you're in my own practice, I've gotten very, very good, probably to the displeasure of some teachers at and being like, I'm going to do whatever feels good. But even still, like, I catch myself, especially with newer teachers or teachers who don't know me, like, I notice myself being like, wow, I wish I could stop doing this thing, but I want them to know that I can do it. And that's like the perfectionism that is still exists.
Right.
Powerfully. And just being able to recognize and being like, no, I have this power in my own practice. And I think that that's one thing that makes a big difference too. As a trauma-informed yoga teacher, if you are able to convey that agency to your students, there's a very good chance that they'll take that with them to other teachers too, right? That even when they go into a class where maybe the teacher doesn't say the same things I'm saying, they'll still know, like, I can do whatever I want to do, and that's great. And I know that because I've gotten that from other teachers who have given me that space, and I've taken that to other studios where I kind of know that maybe the teacher is a little bit kind of more focused on me doing this alignment and this pose exactly this way, and I just don't do it.
Right. And that's right. And I think what you said, I think a good, and I'm trauma-informed, I'm just trauma-informed yoga teacher, I think, in my opinion, I'm biased, but it's just a good yoga teacher, it's like just to have that in your tool belt, they'll give you, that should be like, a huge part of yoga is being able to do what feels good, and hopefully giving that space. So, but unfortunately that's not all yoga teachers, and there certainly is not all people in yoga teacher training, feel that way, unfortunately. So, because I've seen and heard, just because of my role with Integrate, it's like that, I've heard several stories of yoga teacher trainings, like, triggering, people with some of the yoga philosophies, that are taught, like in Patanjali's,
The thing that's
in his,
sorry, I just interrupted.
No, you're good. No, I was gonna go into it.
Is that even, if you take like Ashtanga yoga, for example, which is what a lot of Western yoga is based on, and I have a Mysore Ashtanga practice as well, which people often consider like to be super rigid, and you have to do it exactly one way because it's a set sequence. But really, like a big piece of the philosophy of that system of yoga is, this quote that you probably see all over the place. It says that yoga is 1% theory and 99% practice. So it actually really is focused on the experience of the practitioner. And so I think that if you're really if you choose to follow those philosophies to their root, that you actually do see that it's really focused on the person's experience on their own.
That is awesome to hear. That is really, I think that's really good. I like Ashtanga as well, and I haven't gone deep into the philosophy of it before, but that's really good to hear for sure. So, okay. So let's go to, so our next question is, so in Integrate, we often discuss the importance of understanding race relations as a part of a trauma-informed yoga practice. As a white practitioner, how do you bring practice, or how do you bring into practice issues of race in your relationships with students of color?
Yeah, so that's a big issue and a big question, and one that I do think about a lot. And there's kind of two ways that I think about it. Is that, like, even before you get to who is in the room that you're teaching, we're talking about a practice that, as we talked about, comes from India, and there are appropriation questions that come with that. And for me, I think the biggest thing, as I've thought about it, is just to make sure that you keep talking about this with other teachers and within the yoga community in the US, for example, asking yourself questions that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, and really just trying to find the balance. Between, like, on the one hand, honoring this culture that yoga comes from, and that means using Sanskrit when I teach, pronouncing it as correctly as I can, and then also knowing the philosophy of this practice, even if I don't reference it a lot in my class, for example, so that when students come to me and they have questions, I know kind of where to sit in. And again, we do teach that as a requirement in our teacher trainings, because, and again, it's even in the teacher training, it's balancing, okay, here's this philosophy. How do you, as an individual person with agency, interpret, like, how this fits into your life right here, right now? And then, so there's, like, balancing all of that with also, like, how do we make this an accessible practice here in the West? Like, how do we make it so that it applies to people's lives, and it feels healing and useful, especially for people who have experienced trauma? And that does sometimes require a little bit of change in the way that we teach it.
Absolutely. I think that was a really brilliant statement on how you, because it is like a constant balancing act, of addressing the obvious, that you have, that you're white, but you're also doing a very, ancient practice that originated in with people of color from India, so that's, I think you answered that really well. Okay.
And then actually the second piece of that is also something that comes up a lot in studios, and especially when we're teaching with TrueU, because, like I mentioned, the majority of students we work with are students of color who are from low-income school districts.
Yes.
And I'm always very cognizant of, walking into a space as a thin, able-bodied white woman, trying to introduce this practice to potentially students who have never seen it before, and potentially the only experience they've had with yoga is seeing people who look exactly like me, like doing yoga on Instagram or in magazines in, like, expensive clothing.
Right.
That's something that I'm super aware of. Um, and so one thing that I think is super important, especially for our organization, is just representation. So having more representation of people of color within the yoga community, because they exist.
Right.
They do incredible work, but they're not always on the cover of like Yoga Journal, for example.
No.
Um,
No.
and also making sure that we have more diversity, and not just racial diversity, but more diversity on our teaching staff with TrueU.
Right.
And that's huge for us. And that's something that we're still, I mean, we're certainly not where we should be yet on that. And we keep working towards that. And then the rest of it is also, again, like, how do I teach in a trauma-informed manner in a way that's not hierarchical? Because the trauma of racism is like very real. And again, that should be covered in all trauma-informed yoga teaching or trainings.
Exactly.
And while I can't pretend to know what that at all feels like in my body, I can try to take that yoga trauma-informed training and then bring it into my teaching, and hopefully create a space where people feel like they're welcome, like they can come exactly as they are, like they are in charge of their practice, and like they're in charge and it's not me. And then the last thing I would say to that, which I also am very passionate about and could talk for a very long time about, but will not, is this idea of spiritual bypass.
I could talk all day long about that. Yeah.
So maybe we do like a separate talk about that. And maybe is more diverse than the two of us. But the idea of spiritual bypass is this idea that you're taking spiritual teachings like those found in a lot of yoga teachings that say, that we're all one, that we want to be positive, we want to love our neighbors, all of that stuff, and using it to kind of bypass the actual lived experiences that people are feeling. So you see that, for example, after, a shooting of a person of color by a white police officer, for example, and you see a lot of kind of outpouring of, we are all one, we just need to love each other more, coming from a lot of the time from the yoga community and from other religious communities or spiritual communities as well. And even though like that might be true, when you really, really get down to it, like that is in no way helpful, and really bypasses the very traumatic experiences that, in this case, people of color are experiencing in America. And so that's the other piece that we always kind of talk about in teacher training, and that I also try to avoid and also correct when I see in the yoga community, because I think that's really, really important.
Okay. No, absolutely. That was really, I think you hit the nail on the head as far as establishing kind of the representation. Absolutely. No, you answered that beautifully. So that's what, it is a big issue. And I think the macro issue as well, because I think sometimes like with yoga, it's all about like yourself and your relationship with yourself, but like we don't really always look at or address with the spiritual bypass piece, the macro systems that are creating like our sense of self, which is like, you can't like disassociate from that, and I think that it goes back to what you were saying about the bypass. We're like, well, that, the systems that we are living in actually do create our mirrors to what the world says about what you look like and who you are. So I think that was a very nice, concise answer with a huge that could go anywhere. So, okay. So I
have a lot of learning to do, but.
So how do you also address gender issues? So we talked about this a little bit, but we'll go a little bit more direct with it. How do you address gender issues in your scope of practice? And are there words or phrases that you use or do not use, given your guys' TrueU or whatever your own practice is with trauma-informed people, that you guys steer away from, given this framework?
Yeah, so like I said, this has definitely evolved, both in TrueU and then also in my own teaching practice. And so obviously we changed our mission in a way to be focused on all gender identities. And then that also necessarily has to be reflected in the way that we teach a class. So it means that we're not saying like, all right, girls, like, all right, ladies. If it's all boys, we're not saying all right, boys, or if we're assuming it's all boys. So using a lot more neutral language, which we actually often use with TrueU. We usually use crew. And that's totally because Meredith says it all the time, and I've just started using it. So we'll be like, okay, crew, let's do this.
Oh, that's a good one.
So that's one, and that's the biggest one, I think, because usually we usually have a big enough group that we're addressing the group as a whole. Usually we have the benefit of, because we're working with, it's not like when you're in a studio where a random person comes in and you don't know anything about them, you can't assume anything about them. Generally, when we're working with an after-school program or a school or something like that, we have like a social worker or, someone who knows the kids really, really well, or the teens really, really well. And so we can ask the right questions in that sense. Like, is there anything we should know about gender identity that, so that we're not assuming the wrong thing? And there have also been certain programs we've worked with where they also, like on their name tags, if it'll be a camp or something, they'll have their gender identity, which is helpful. But especially when you're working with kids and teens, there's just so much self-discovery still happening there that we usually just use the most neutral language we can. And that's also another area where we still have, I think, learning to do. And so we're also really focused. We have an amazing staff of 2 incredible women in DC. And we're always kind of thinking with them and working with them on like, how do we get more of this training to our teachers? Because we have a pretty large group of volunteer teachers in both DC and Oklahoma City. And now we're starting up over on this coast. So.
Awesome. Well, that's exciting. That is so exciting. And I like how you say crew. That's a really good way of like encompassing everything. It's a really good inclusive word. I love it. Okay, so last question. Okay, so all this work can create a lot of burnout and compassion fatigue. Out the huzzah. What self-care practices do you personally use to minimize burnout?
So, big surprise. I really like yoga.
Yeah.
Yoga is really, really helpful to me. And it's really in the times when I feel most like stressed out and like perfection focused, that yoga becomes especially obviously important to me. And it's really those times that I kind of remember that it's not just because still, moving your body feels really good. Exercise gives you endorphins. And so there are certainly days where I'm focused more on the physical part of my practice, and just how good it makes me feel in my body. But it's especially those times where I'm like, okay, I just need to do like 5 sun salutations on my mat in my tiny dorm room, which is where I am right now. And like 3 minutes of breathing. And that's what I'm doing today because I'm so stressed out. And that's been really, really helpful. And it's something that I'm still working on, is like this idea that it still counts if I only do 5 minutes of it. I also am a huge fan of talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
That's for me. I do that once a week and I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I love it. It's
right.
And then actually I also really, really love boxing.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes hitting things in a really constructive way is really awesome. So I love hitting things. And I'm always trying to do more writing is one thing that is part of my like New Year's resolution that I'm feeling pretty miserably at, is doing more writing and also doing more meditation. So those are like 2 self-care goals. But
awesome. That sounds pretty all encompassing, pretty comprehensive. So, well, that's awesome. Well, very good. Well, I love the kickboxing or the kickboxing thing, or boxing. Was it boxing? Is that what you said, or kickboxing?
So I was working I was training at a studio in DC that was like mixed martial arts and
okay.
So and encompassing, and there was an amazing community there. So that was really, really fun. But they're called Influx, if you know them.
Okay.
And so I'm still figuring it out over here. So for now, it's mostly boxing and kickboxing.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. We have a couple of MMA gyms over here that's really fun, like that are fun here in St. Louis. So that's cool. That's very cool. I hear a lot of good things about it. And it's a nice, like, because I was telling my friend, sometimes you have to, like boxing is good because, it's a nice contrast to the yoga, because sometimes, it's just you get a little bit more feedback, with things, the body. So I can see how that's probably really helpful.
And it's like, it depends on, sometimes yoga just either feels like too much or too little for what's going on. And I think especially for women too, like we tend to kind of pass right over any anger we feel, for example. Yeah. And hitting stuff can be a super productive way to work through that. So yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. And thank you. These are some really great answers. And so I'm going to stop recording here. And we'll go follow through. Hold on one second. Okay. Let me stop recording. Let's see here. We're going to stop. Okay.